Good afternoon. I have a question for you. Would you like a glass of Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, American whiskey, or rye whiskey? This is a question that many people would be unable to answer, or they would be confused or stumped by it. But hopefully, after this speech, you will be better informed on how to make this decision. Many people are unaware of the different types of whiskey and styles associated with the art of whiskey making. And I used to wonder about these same things too until I visited a distillery and I learned about the art of whiskey. Knowing the differences and the many different styles of whiskey can be useful in any social situation in order to help you better choose a spirit in which you wish to enjoy. We will be going over the basic differences in the different types of whiskey from Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey, American whiskey, and rye whiskey. To start, we'll be talking about my personal favorite, Irish whiskey. According to an article from RealMenDrinkWhiskey.com, Irish whiskey is any whiskey that is aged in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. It must be distilled to an alcohol by volume, or ABV, of 94.8% or less, and it must be made from yeast-fermented grain mash. Irish whiskey must be aged for at least 3 years in wood barrels. But normally, most distilleries will age their whiskey for longer in order to improve the quality, the taste, and the coloring of the whiskey, since most of the flavors are derived from the wood of the barrel. Irish whiskey, when compared to the other styles, has some of the most relaxed distilling rules and laws associated with it, giving it a larger spectrum of flavors and unique styles. And the final and one big difference between Irish whiskey and, say, Scotch whiskey is that it is spelled differently. And now next, we will be going over Scotch whiskey, one of the most popular and sought after spirits in the world. Scotch whiskey is one of the most popular and some of the most sought after whiskey in the world, according to an article by Dr. Loonhaig on whiskey.com. By law, it must be made 100% in Scotland in order to be labeled as Scotch whiskey. It first must be made from a mash of malted barley prior to adding the yeast for the fermentation process. But most distilleries will add different grains and flavorings or colorings to increase the flavor of the Scotch. There can be no fermentation additives or shortcuts in the fermentation process in order for it to be labeled as Scotch whiskey by law. Scotch whiskey must also be aged for 3 years in oak cask. But much like other whiskeys, including Irish whiskey, and American whiskey, and rye whiskey, they usually will age it longer in order to increase the flavoring and the colorization and the quality of the Scotch, because the longer it's in the barrels, the more flavor it will derive from the oak. Also, much like Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey's alcohol by volume, or ABV, must be no more than 94.8%. Lastly, I will be going over two of the most common and closely related whiskey styles, American whiskey and rye whiskey. American whiskeys are broken down into 3 distinct styles: Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and rye whiskey. According to an article on the Art of Manliness, both bourbon and Tennessee whiskey must be made from a mash that is at least 51% corn, and rye whiskey must be made from a mash that is at least 51% rye, and only select distilleries will make it from anything higher than the 51%. Both must be distilled to an alcohol by volume of no more than 80%, which is then watered down prior to the aging process to around 62.5% before it is put and aged into the barrels. In both spirits, both Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and rye whiskey must be aged in charred oak barrels. And unlike Scotch and Irish whiskey, there are no aging requirements for American whiskey and rye whiskey, even though, like most other whiskeys, they will age it typically longer in order to, once again, increase the flavor of the whiskey that is aging from the barrels. And the main difference between the two more distinct American whiskeys, Tennessee whiskey and Kentucky bourbon, is that Kentucky bourbon must be made in Bourbon County, Kentucky in order to be labeled as such. And Tennessee whiskey must be made in Tennessee. And also, prior to the bottling process, Tennessee whiskey is filtered through charcoal sugar, which is a very unique process that is very specific to Tennessee whiskey. No other whiskeys in the world do this, and that is one of the main reasons that it has been labeled so uniquely. So, in conclusion, There are many different styles and types of whiskey, each with its own unique flavor and process behind it. And hopefully now you have a base of understanding and some of the more common types of whiskey that will open you up to the unique and interesting world of the art of whiskey making. And always remember to be sure to enjoy responsibly.